All right. I do have a tendency not to talk super loud, so if anyone can't hear me, hands up, let me know, and I will talk a little louder, but until then, I'll try to eat the mic. I'm Dusty Evanoff. I'm with 10x AI. Today, if you read the invite for SecKC, I'm not giving the same talk that's on there, so sorry. That's how it works. If you want that one, hang out with me afterwards. Instead, pivoting a little bit, something maybe slightly more offensive with a tool drop at the end. So if you want some stuff to play with, this is the place to be. Just a quick show of hands for the people I can see. It's a bit dark or bright or whatever, but how many people are regularly using an AI coding assistant of some kind? Some hands, not a lot. Cool. How many people work at a place where someone is using an AI coding assistant at some point in time? You have developers who are going nuts with AI. Awesome. Cool. Well, this is to scare you a little bit about what's happening in your network, and then hopefully provide you with a little bit of tooling to be able to speak to that. So start with a story. If you've been around for a bit, this might be something you've heard. If you're a little bit newer, this has happened like back in 2013, so maybe it's new to you. But Bob was a developer at a US critical infrastructure organization. Back in 2013, he thought it'd be a good idea to outsource his job to a consultancy in China. He FedExed his RSA token to that consultancy, gave him his creds. They VPN'd every day into the network using his credentials while he just hung out at his desk, just on Reddit, watching cat vids, like legit watching cat videos. And Bob got fired. Poor Bob. We could probably figure out why, right? The funny thing about all of this, though, is if we kind of fast forward 13 years, and not drawing like a direct parallel, but now we have a bunch of developers who are in effect outsourcing some of the work they do to another tool, giving it access to the file system that they have access to, giving them access to a terminal, same network access, and while the LLMs maybe are trusted, there's a lot in the ecosystem that they're taking advantage of that are not. That's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Now, from an AI perspective, again, kind of a quick show of hands, how many people have like legit security concerns about AI, or you kind of just soured on it a bit? And like, I'm not a huge fan of AI. I think it sucks, or it has sucked. Is there anybody that's in that kind of boat? Yes, no, maybe no? Yeah, all right. At least one. Cool. Here's the thing. For me, and I think for a lot of people back in like the early 2010s, if you remember back then, if you've been around then, there are a lot of concerns or kind of similar concerns around the cloud as well, right? If you're like me, you're like, hey, I'm not going to let someone else hang on to my data, my company's data, run services and workloads on infrastructure I can't see, I can't protect, I can't monitor, and it didn't matter. Like, I just got to the cloud game like very late, had a chance to kind of get ahead of the curve and to really just kind of like take a leadership role in terms of how we moved to the cloud or what we did. Instead, I put myself at a disadvantage, and a lot of stuff happened kind of without my input and without me being able to like really contribute to how we do that. If you look at the growth of cloud, like corporate data, how it's moved since 2015, this is like up to 2022, but it kind of doubled in that amount of time, right? Like, stop it, don't stop it, whatever it's happening. How many CTOs, have been hired in the last 10, 12 years because they were promising some kind of digital transformation, right? There we go. Yeah.
So, test.
You want this one?
I guess it's not working. So we have a little tradition here at SecKC, and it's usually if you've never given a talk, but apparently you've given several, but we like doing this anyway, so cheers. Also, there was a weather alert. You might want to stay inside. They're calling for 3-inch hail. So just a heads up.
How does this thing go back in here? There we go. All right. No. There we are. Okay. So like the growth that we've seen in the cloud, or what we saw between like 2015, 2017, the use of Gen AI, like that happened in a year, right? There's like no getting around this. You've got boards who are asking executives constantly how they're using AI, what's going on with AI. they're going to cut you out of the equation, like the conversation, right? If we're not kind of getting ahead of this. And the problem is, like, there's a lot of issues with what's going on. The cool thing about this is, though, this is like a really exciting time from a security perspective to get into this stuff. If you think about like 30 years ago when like stack-based buffer overflows were first talked about, like in Frac, you know, like smashing the stack. If you've read that, if you haven't, do it. But like, you know, 30, 25 years ago, like you could just grep for stir copy, you know, like functions and source code and land on things that were like insecure and have a chance to kind of find bugs. And now like the barrier to entry just to get into like memory exploitation is insanely more complicated, right? I don't know if anyone does that. I think we've had some people talk about that a couple months ago, but the number of things that you need to know to get into that, the number of bugs that are like easy to find, like there's a reason that Apple's paying what they are for you know, like working exploits on iOS. But like from an LLM perspective, an AI perspective, like there are bugs everywhere. Like the attack surface is absolutely massive. You don't even need to know how to code to get into this and start testing stuff. So it's a really fun time if you like to like poke and prod and break things to get into this. And we'll talk about that kind of the attack surface and what that looks like momentarily. Now there's two kind of categories of attack surfaces that I'm going to talk about. One is like more generic. It's like the AI-enabled apps. So if you think about like all of the AI crap that like companies have been putting out where like AI doesn't even make sense necessarily in the product. So that's kind of one side of it. The other side is like this IDE piece, right? And there's kind of some crossover into like CI/CD workloads and things like that we'll talk about as well. But if you're kind of new to this, if it's something you've kind of been following and you just haven't taken the leap, I want to kind of give you a few resources first on the app side before we talk about the IDE side. So if you really don't know kind of the attack surface in terms of what it looks like, a couple of good places to start, like MITRE Atlas, if you're familiar, and I think everyone probably is with MITRE ATT&CK at this point. MITRE Atlas is MITRE ATT&CK, but for AI, like Gen AI, et cetera, right? And if you really just kind of want to start to understand what types of attacks exist so you can dig into those, it's a good place to start. OWASP also has a couple of top 10s they've put out. If you have apps that are going out in your environment or your companies or things that you're kind of even wanting to threat model yourself, Cloud Security Alliance has Maestro, and obviously like NIST is coming in with their long list of things that will put you to sleep at night. If you want to start playing with these things, there's some free tools online. Has anyone been to Gandalf and done the challenges at Gandalf? Yeah, like they're super fun, right? Like it's a great introduction. If you're like going to sleep during this talk, just open your phone and go to Gandalf and hang out there. There's 7 levels there. You'll find that like some of the things will actually work across levels. There is another kind of iteration they put out called Agent Breaker. When you get to those things, if you find that those are not that challenging, the Dreadnought CTF they've got built out of the challenges they have are also awesome. These things are free, so you can go to any of these things and start kind of testing the waters and playing around with like prompt injection, jailbreaking, etc. Some of these, like it says, are going to be like tool abuse and starting to kind of hit the things we're talking about in this talk. Once you kind of get bored of doing some of these things, like you know, in a more manual way through a website, there are a number of tools that you can start to look at as well to get started in this. Like Pirate is a Python-based tool that Microsoft's AI Red team put out. Like you can use LLMs to start attacking LLMs, which is kind of fun. But it's not kind of an automated point-and-shoot thing. It takes a little bit getting into. Prompt Foo, I think, was just acquired, but there's kind of some different types of tools here to play with. Again, just some resources for you to look at. Now, kind of getting into the meat here. Modern AI IDEs. Now, for those people who said that they've been using these things, is everyone kind of, again, like skills, rules, you know, tool calls, etc. How many people feel like they kind of have a handle of that or have started to use those things? It'll kind of help me understand how much time to spend on some of these conversations. I see a few hands, not a ton. So like if you've been to ChatGPT, if you've been to Claude, if you've gone to the website, this is very, very different in terms of the utility you can get out of these tools. There are a number of ways in which you can inject additional information into these and add capabilities to make them work for you. The prompt, hopefully you know about. If you've played around with prompting AI, you'll find like a bigger, better prompt can generally lead to more specific or better results. But if you're writing long prompts and you're doing things in a repetitive way, ideally you have something that we would probably use in programming or some other type of a skill where you have some reusable versions of prompts, right? That's kind of available in the context assembly layer with like rule files, memory, skills, etc. We'll talk about those in a second a little more. You have your LLM reasoning, which again, you've seen and played with. You have tool calls. There's a layer of permissions and permission checks that come into play with these, and then tools that can actually do execution on your system. Along the way as well, you have a couple of layers of hooks. It says post-execution here. I forgot to put in pre-execution, but you have them on both directions. And again, we'll talk about that. So start the context layer first. Rule files, they work a little bit differently in different IDEs, but the idea is like if you want that to always do something every time you prompt it, instead of asking it every prompt, you can encode it into a file. It's just a markdown file that you can put. The naming conventions are different based on the IDE, but the idea is you can have those load into every conversation and use it. So like let's say you want to write some code in Python and you always want to docstring everything you write, or you want to follow certain conventions. You can put that into a rules file, and every time you ask the assistant to do something, it's going to reference that rule file. Now they again work different IDEs. Like in Cursor, you can give it, like you can have it selectively choose a rule file based on a description. It can figure out if it's applicable or not. But every IDE has some concept of this rule file, right? Additionally, and a little bit newer, is this concept of skills, where you can kind of create a more specialized version of what isn't that different from a rule file. Again, it's just a markdown file, but you add a description, and these do get loaded selectively by the IDE. So if you wanted to, for example, have a skill that knew how to interpret like virus total results, you know, or interpret some other tool that you're going to use, potentially output from an MCP tool that you're going to install. Those skill files can define how it does that, and it adds a lot of utility because now you can start to like really add very specialized like knowledge or instructions, but do it situationally. So if you have like 100 skills files, for example, that you built up over time, which is probably a lot for most IDEs, but there are situations where you're gonna have a lot. What will happen is it's gonna look at the description only before it loads the rest of the skills. What's interesting about skills though is they usually get packaged with scripts as well as reference files. So you can add additional references for deeper understanding and have it just straight up execute scripts in certain situations or call scripts from the skill. Now, if that's kind of getting your brain to start moving a little bit and the wheels to start turning, right, I will tell you like these things can be installed via plugins, and skills can also be installed from like third-party systems, right? This is part of like the supply chain ecosystem of the IDE. So whether you write it yourself or not, like they're definitely different like threats that you have to consider. Now, memory is a third area of context that gets pulled in. If you've ever worked with an IDE like this, again, you've worked over time, you might see that it starts to understand what you want and what you're asking for. Memory can persist across session, like either in your project or for you as a user. Again, it's a markdown file, but the assistant's actually going to create and maintain this as you go. So it's going to try to understand what it is you're asking when you correct it, when you kind of QA the results, and you give kind of a back and forth. Memory is where it's going to maintain this, okay? Now again, these are all text files. They're all markdown files sitting on the system somewhere, which again can, you know, if you start thinking about what that attack surface looks like, hopefully this is kind of getting the wheels going a bit. For tools and permissions, has anyone seen dangerously skip permissions? Has anyone seen that? Yeah, that's how you roll when you want to get work done and you want to sleep, okay? You set it up, you give it that, and it stops asking you if it's okay to whatever, okay? It is legitimately like a very strong pattern for developing in these things if you really want to be efficient. It's also a great way to lose everything in your project. Now, one of the questions around this hopefully is going to be, how can we do this and do it safely, right? Because at the end of the day, if we have developers that are using this, if we're using this for our products, we want to figure out that nice balance between like how are we secure and how are we productive. When you talk about permissions, though, aside from that specific permission, if you dig around like in Claude, there is a JSON file that gets configured. Every time you see the pop-up, is it okay if I do this? And you say yes, or there's an allow blah, blah, blah for me or for everyone. When you click that second option, it's going to register that in the JSON file. It will save that as a setting within either, again, your personal profile or like everything you do, or the project or like everything you do. And it will stop asking, right? It's another text file that takes some input, and the IDE uses that as a config. MCP plugins, he's been around for a while now. He's a couple years old at this point. They were meant to be like a do-it-all kind of way of adding tools, an extensible way of adding tools to projects, right? If you started messing with like LangChain or some of the really early agentic frameworks, like back in 2023-ish or whatever, you probably were like super frustrated because as soon as you built some stuff out and you had it working and whatever, there was like a massive refactor, and multiple projects have gone through that, right? So whenever you had to implement your own tool calls and integrate with things manually, what you found was like every time this big refactor happened, everything broke. MCP was kind of the answer to that. It was meant to be a standard you could follow, you could use it everywhere. At the end of the day, it's like a very simple standard. If you look at it, if you've ever written an MCP server, it's basically Python code. The functions are Python functions, they're just decorated. And there's like a large doc string that tells you how to use it. And if you don't know what doc string is, basically it's like a multi-line kind of comment within the function that just defines what the function does, like what it takes for inputs, outputs, etc. It's something that the model can regard and learn how to use those things. From a hook perspective, this is another thing that we can utilize from a security perspective, or not. But a lot of, at least with Claude especially, I've not used these in other tools, but I'm going to guess they exist. Apologies for not knowing, I suck. But the hooks allow you to call scripts as actions occur. So like in these handoffs between the different things that interact within the architecture, hooks give you a way to add some logic to do things. And we'll talk about how we can leverage those from a security perspective in the crappy tool I'm going to drop at the end to see how we can kind of start to play with that and use it to defend. But also to be aware of the fact that like it can be used in other insidious ways as well. From an attack perspective now, again, talk about those wheels turning in your head, so let's talk about kind of real world what's happened. The dangerously skip permissions, I hope you figured that one out when you just give an LLM access to your file system and your terminal, and you just say, go, here's my creds. Bad things can happen. There's a lot of examples of these bad things happening. It's not hard to search, but for example, in some cases, like you can RMRF and like it'll just drop a tilde in there somewhere and like delete your home directory when that expands, which is like super awesome to wake up to in the morning. Is like your home directory is gone. It might make decisions. If anyone's seen like the end of Silicon Valley when Son of Anton's reward function is not well tuned or whatever, it's not well defined. When it's like, hey, I told it to find cheap hamburgers, and it ordered 4,000 pounds of hamburger to the office because that was the cheapest way to buy hamburgers, apparently. AI still has some of those issues, but maybe, not exactly that. But when you ask it to optimize something, for example, you may find that it does not optimize for what you wish to optimize for. The looping that comes, so this dangerously skip permissions piece is really powerful when it's combined with looping. Again, like if you actually want to be efficient and you can avoid like destroying your data or doing something crazy, there's ways that you can loop and have your code iterate on itself or have the agent iterate on its own output. There's like a Ralph Wiggum loop plugin that people have used, or like a function that people will talk about where you basically like have a hook that calls your prompt again and continually like re-triggers before it finishes until it's satisfied. So like, hey, if you've ever like written code and you say, hey, does this work, or what are the problems with this, and you kind of have AI QA itself, you can essentially set up a loop where it does that. Has anyone, like, ideally you have, but if you haven't, I guess I'm going to recommend that you do that. If you get bad output from AI, just ask it to review it, right? Or give it a different persona and ask it to review that persona, and you're going to find that it finds a bunch of bugs, and when it's done, it's kind of self-improving. If you can set it on a loop and let it work overnight, you don't care how many tokens get burned, or you can kind of just have a circuit breaker that exits after so many loops. You can basically just have it write and iterate on the project until it works, right? You can define the outcomes that you want and let it go, and if you dangerously skip permissions, you can sleep right through it, and you can hope everything turns out okay. Usually it's fine. There's an article a couple days ago too about a Terraform destroy where someone was migrating a production setup, had 2.5 years of data into it. He'd forgotten to move the state file, and so did the AI, and by the time he realized it, he lost 2.5 years of production data. Prompt injection, if you haven't seen it, there's a couple of fun areas for that to happen. Comments get read by the AI as if they're not comments at times. Invisible Unicode can as well, a lot harder to spot, hence the invisibility piece. There's also vectors we've seen where like documents, like Word docs, will have like a very small, like 1-point font, all in white in the document, and some of the readers that actually like will read the docs, like work with like Word docs, etc., will still read those instructions. Things that are going to be too difficult for you to see or scan for will get read by the AI. And of those examples, we've seen them in several places. So if you think through that settings JSON, top left, there we go. Settings JSON is like where those settings for permissions go, right? When you click that button, if you can get the agent to append to that somehow, you can start adding permissions like auto approve into somebody else's environment. If you can write a plugin that can be used, or a skill that they will use, or in this case, maybe a GitHub issue, and they're doing something with the GitHub issue, maybe they're pulling that project and working in it, etc. Like you have a way to start actually executing things on their code, or on their box. Prompt Pwn was similar. That one was a prompt injection via the issue title. In that case, there were 5 confirmed Fortune 500 companies that were impacted. GitHub secrets being leaked. Yeah, and so on and so forth. I think you get the idea for that one. So essentially, though, at the end of the day, rules files, memory files, permissions, MCP servers, skills, hooks, all of these things are the attack surface. All of them are injectable because all of them are observed by the AI, right? So when we start to think about like how to defend this, we have a couple of options. If anyone's done like any web app testing from a security perspective, like what's the one rule that you always pay attention to is like untrusted data is untrusted, right? You always have to sanitize it. You always have to deal with like how you're gonna protect against that, whether it's like in an HTTP heading or like an input parameter, etc., right? And it's the same thing here. The problem with these things is, again, there are entire websites set up and ecosystems set up for rules sharing that people will share. People just grab them. It looks good at the top. They'll add them in, right? Am I going to really write a better Python rule than whatever author has done? Is the person maintaining that repository actually looking at what's in there? Probably not, hopefully, but again, skills the same way. You can install those very quickly and easily. There are a lot of ecosystems where those get pushed out. MCP servers, again, all of these things get shared, right? Once something like that gets into your environment, let's say, hey, I'm using Microsoft's OpenAI in Azure, or I'm using our enterprise Claude code, I'm good. Yeah, except for that app that's not training on your data or storing your data, or so they say, right? It's going to be combined now with all the things your developers are using to make themselves more efficient and to implement these features. They're kind of shortcutting having to develop these things themselves, and in doing so, you're also introducing untrusted code. So what's the answer to this? I don't know if this is the answer, but there's not a tool available that I could find that does something like this. So the idea was to try to address these things with what I would say is a very, very, very crappy at this stage tool, but that works better than anything else because I don't think there's anything else that does it. The idea is this. We want to start to address these things in layers. We're talking about, at times, using an LLM to defend against an LLM. LLMs are not deterministic, right? They'll miss things. If you look at like some of the secure code review stuff that's come out recently, one of the critiques was like, hey, if we review the same code base multiple times, there are different sets of findings, right? It doesn't always find all the same things every time. So we want to think about this as a defense in depth problem. There are some good products and tools that are available, and what I attempted to do was glue them all together in a way that like hopefully is not too difficult to use. So there are kind of 9 parts to this that all kind of work together. There's a Docker sandbox. So if you're familiar with Docker, there are Docker containers, but now there's also Docker sandbox. Containers work, like if you're running in Linux, the container is going to work on the same kernel, right? You're going to use a bunch of Linux security features to run that container. You can actually run containers without Docker at all by taking advantage of those with some cool videos if that's of interest to you. If you're on Windows, you're going to get native Linux now with WSL2. So again, there's not really there is a hypervisor layer, I guess WSL2, right? Because you get the hypervisor that's built in. With Docker Sandbox, just generically, when you're running that with Docker Desktop, you're going to get a hypervisor. There's a micro VM that it runs in so that you're not sharing kernel space with your host while you run these things, but you still get the same kind of features that you'd get from a container in terms of isolation. In addition to the Docker Sandbox, which is where this kind of begins, right? We're going to run Claude, for example, in Docker Sandbox, which is going to provide a layer of isolation. Then we go ahead and add a proxy to create some outbound denies or allows. So we just allow list outbound connections to things like Claude for auth, for hitting the, for submitting prompts, etc. You can add additional network connections that you want to permit, but the idea is like if something spawns a shell, tries to curl, steal secrets, etc., it doesn't have a route to get where it needs to go. If you do use tools for like web search in Claude, it should be running from their cloud when it does the web search. So you have some options in terms of like how to work with that. One of the next kind of pieces of the attack surface here is credential proxy, or the defense, I guess, piece is the credential proxy, because when you're working with a container, as you know, they're not very fantastic ways of getting your credentials into it, right? You can do Docker secrets, but it's basically just a mount. It's discoverable. You can use an environment variable. Also discoverable, you can mount a file in. Also something that you can find on that host. Credential proxy is kind of a cool idea. It's something that exists with the Docker sandboxes that came with, or that the Docker's provided for running Claude code in. And that injects the credential at the network layer after it's like left the container, so to speak. It's built into the binary. So you only have a limited number of things that you can inject credentials into, but there are some additional projects for that if it's interesting to you. You're gonna have to like man in the middle, I think, to do more. But the idea was like for things that we know you're gonna use, like your GitHub token, Anthropic API key, etc., use the credential proxy to inject, and then layer on top of that canary tokens. So what happens if we do just go ahead and drop an environment variable with a fake token, and we start monitoring for that in tool calls with our hooks, right? Same thing with like we can drop some AWS cred files, etc. If we're doing the injection, there's a little bit of testing I need to do with this. I'm gonna be honest, this finally worked for me like 3 hours ago. But the idea there is to provide a layer of defense where you can actually detect your credentials being stolen by the untrusted plugin, etc., that you're gonna use. On top of that, there are a number of hooks that get put in place to look at writes to those files that we talked about, those sensitive files, your settings files, memories, etc. In between like your prompts and tool calls and so on. You have them going both ways. They're all named this way and documented in the document, looking for skills being modified, etc. Sorry, also looking at when you pull them down. So should be doing some examination now of MCP servers if you load them. So when you load the MCP server, at the time you're loading it, it should be examined as well as skills. Another layer, because why not be paranoid? There's a separate guardrails sidecar. So if you're familiar with like how sidecars work from a Kubernetes perspective, very similar. A second container is spun up next to your sandbox container. Within that, it's running both some ML classifiers as well as I think Guardrails AI. So we're pulling down some of the validators from Guardrails AI. What that allows you to do then is look for specific things, both from an ML perspective and using an LLM. So looking for things like, hey, do I see PII in this request? Does this look like a bash command? Does this look like, it's exfiltrating data or it's encoded, etc. Again, looking for these things that we hope to be able to detect. This is obviously a couple of hours old, so bear with me. It could be fun to try to break this. There are probably a lot of opportunities to do that. But again, there's a mechanism now to kind of take those prompts and tool calls, essentially, that you're seeing and have them validated outside of the container they're running in a way that's isolated from the workload. With the MCP audit hook as well, or the gate that's there, the idea is also to start looking at the MCP tool calls. Again, another layer of defense in terms of what's happening there. Remember, your MCP servers are basically just Python code functions that are getting called. It's not that hard to write one. If you know Python, or if you want to even just fire one of these things up, it'll be really easy to write them. So the idea is that we want to audit what's happening within those, make sure they work the way that we think they do. Add it to memory protection as well. Again, those memories that get written as you use the assistant or as your assistant works, where it starts to learn from you and from your project and what you're doing. If a tool has the ability to modify that memory file, it will persist through sessions as things come up, down, etc. So being able to protect that is another priority. So all in all, added several layers of coverage from a defense perspective, or at least attempted to. Again, like very new from a tool perspective. If this is interesting to you, though, would absolutely love to talk to you about it, or feel free to contribute. It's public now. So feel free to like PR, just don't put a bunch of hidden Unicode in it, jerks. But yeah, if you do improve it, if you want to steal it, I don't care. Like, feel free to make it better. Like I said, this doesn't exist as far as I'm aware, and it should. Ideally, like, Anthropic will make something like this that just works really easily, and we don't have to worry about it. But until then, we're kind of on our own. That said, a couple things real quick, if I can throw it in there. We are hiring. If this is interesting to you, if AI is interesting, we have AI engineer spots. I'm hiring for my team. And if you're interested in AI just generally, and you'd be interested in taking part in a hackathon, there's a table in the back with my employer's stuff on it. We're kind of gauging interest and seeing if that's something we'd want to sponsor. We would try to teach you guys how to use some of these tools more effectively for a couple of hours, and then set you loose in teams and let you do some cool stuff. So that said, questions, heckles, curse words? Thank you. You're amazing.